I didn't wait for dessert. The silverware still clicked against china steam, curled off a platter of lemon chicken, and I stood from my mother's long table as if the floor itself had spoken my name. Evan glanced up with that pleasant half-smile he wears when he wants to control a room, and Tasha's fingers tightened around her wine glass until the stem trembled. Family laughter thinned to a fragile hush. I reached into my handbag and touched the folded paper I had rehearsed placing on this table all week. Not yet, not quite, just long enough for my cousin's eyes to flick from my hand to my face and back again. If betrayal makes a sound, it's the quiet scrape of a chair on wood when you decide you won't be the quiet one anymore. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you believe in justice served without shouting, tap subscribe. Because this won't be a story about rage, it will be a story about control. My name is Marla Bennett, and I grew up on sweet tea and front porch summers in a suburb outside Raleigh. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew which dog belonged to which yard, and you returned casserole dishes within the week. My mother worked nights at the hospital for years, and she taught me the kind of kindness that doesn't announce itself, the kind that shows up at your door with soup and stays to do the dishes. Tasha and I were raised more like sisters than cousins, sleepovers on school nights, borrowed clothes, whispered plans about the lives we swore we'd have. I met Evan when I was 28 and stubbornly practical. He held doors, remembered my coffee order, and told me real estate was just people work in nicer shoes. We built something steady, or so it looked, matching paychecks to mortgage payments, vacations on the shoulder seasons, a small yard that felt bigger because it held the two of us. Life settled into a rhythm that people call ordinary, as if that's less than it is. I counseled students through heartbreaks and first jobs. Evan hustled open houses and late showings with a salesman's cheerful grit. Sundays belonged to my mother's table, the good table, the one with the heavy leaf and the water rings that no one bothered to sand away. Tasha brought dessert most weeks, and her laugh could fill a room. She'd been through a rough divorce, and the family made space for her stories, nodding at the right parts, cracking gentle jokes at the others. I believe that making room for someone's sadness was another way to love them. I still do. Looking back, I can see how well harmony wears a mask. Evan's phone lived in his palm more than it used to, but real estate is a tether you pretend is freedom, and I told myself not to keep score. Tasha's hand lingered when she passed him the salad tongs one Sunday. A nothing moment that felt like a draft under a door you thought was shut. He started missing dinners for investor drinks, and she started texting me that she'd keep me company if I didn't want to eat alone, sweet as ever, arriving with a bottle and her favorite lemon bars. I told myself generosity runs in our family. I told myself a lot of things that were almost true. The house we bought together was a modest brick ranch with crepe myrtles out front and a tiny office that I turned into a sanctuary, books stacked in neat rows, a thrift store lamp with a shade that threw warm light, a tray where I kept small comforts I didn't know I'd need. It's funny how a space can hold a future you can't see. All I knew then was that it felt safe. Evan teased me for loving routine, but I liked the calm of it, the way the washing machine thumped in time with the evening news, the way his shoes ended up by the door, even when he swore he'd put them away next time. When he forgot, I moved them, a small forgiveness disguised as tidying. The first slip didn't look like a slip at all. It was a smell expensive, bright, the kind of floral that doesn't fade when the door closes, threaded through Evan's jacket when he hung it on the back of a chair. "Client hugged me," he said, grinning, and kissed my forehead. I laughed because it was easier than turning a question into a quarrel. 2 days later, he texted he'd be late again, and Tasha texted that she'd stop by so I wouldn't eat alone. She arrived with an extra sweater tossed over her arm and a story about a venue that double-booked, and I poured the wine and told her the truth. I was tired. She pressed her cheek to mine and promised it would all feel lighter soon. The next morning, I found a stray gold bobby pin on the passenger floor mat of Evan's car. I don't wear pins, I tucked it into the cup holder and told myself the world is full of explanations if you're determined to be generous. Every family has a table where things are decided, where eyes meet, where silence means more than anyone says. Ours sat under a window that looks out on my mother's magnolia leaves, glossy even in winter petals that only open when the air is ready. That night, her house smelled like lemon oil and roasted chicken, and everyone settled into their places the way people do when they believe tomorrow will look like yesterday. I stood because I'd decided it wouldn't. I slid my hand into my bag and felt the edge of the paper I'd brought cool as a coin, and when I looked up, Tasha was already watching me. I didn't lay it down yet. I wanted one more breath of the old world before I opened the new one. The paper in my bag stayed hidden that night, but once you've touched evidence, you can't go back to ignorance. I drove home with Evan after dinner, my hands steady on the wheel, though my stomach twisted. He hummed along with the radio like nothing had changed, asking if I wanted ice cream on the way. I said no, and he didn't press. That was Evan smooth on the surface, always steering away from turbulence. It began with the smallest shift, the kind you almost laugh at when you try to name it out loud. He came home smelling faintly of perfume, something sharp and expensive, the kind that lingers after the person leaves. I teased him about being hugged too close at a showing, waiting for the grin that would tell me I was being silly. He gave me that grin, kissed my forehead, and changed the subject. For a while I chose to believe him because believing him was easier than holding doubt in my chest. The late nights became more common after that. At first, it was one evening a week, then two, then whole weekends spent on networking events or last-minute investors. I adjusted as I always had. I ate dinner alone or withdrew when he stopped by, washed dishes with the radio on, and left Evan's plate covered in the oven for when he returned. I told myself this was marriage, a balance of patience and hustle. Still, the unease pressed harder every time I slid his untouched fork back into the drawer. Tasha slipped into those empty spaces like she had been waiting for them. She brought over wine on Sunday afternoons when Evan claimed to be tied up or suggested dinner when I said I didn't feel like cooking. She made me laugh the way she always had since we were children, and for a while, I was grateful. I didn't question her eagerness to fill his place, not at first. When you've shared your childhood with someone, it's hard to imagine they'd ever want your life instead of their own. The moment I couldn't shake happened at Thanksgiving. My mother's house was full of noise and smells, turkey crisping in the oven, pies cooling on the counter, children chasing each other down the hallway. I carried a tray of wine glasses back into the dining room and froze in the doorway. Tasha's hand rested on Evan's knee under the table, quick enough to vanish in the space of a breath, but not quick enough to erase. They both laughed at something Drew had said, faces arranged in perfect ease, but my chest tightened like a fist around my ribs. I tried to tell myself it was a slip, a mistake of balance, maybe my eyes playing tricks in the busy room. But the image wouldn't leave me, and with it came a weight that wouldn't lift. After that, I started watching them differently. Every glance they exchanged, every small touch when they thought no one noticed, carried more meaning than I could admit. My cousin had always been affectionate, and Evan had always been charming. That was the excuse I clung to. But affection doesn't explain the way her voice softened when she said we instead of he, or the way his hand lingered on her shoulder just a fraction too long. I lay awake beside him at night, counting the seconds between his breaths, wondering if his dreams carried another woman's name. The first undeniable crack appeared one Saturday at Tasha's house. We were alone, drinking wine on her couch, trading stories about dating apps she claimed to hate but couldn't seem to leave behind. She went to the bathroom, leaving her phone on the cushion beside me. The screen lit up with a message preview bright in the dim room. Can't stop thinking about last night. Wish I could sneak away again tonight. My pulse roared in my ears. For a moment, I told myself It could be anyone, that there must be a dozen men whose names started with E. But when she came back and saw my eyes on her phone, her smile tightened just for a second. She flipped the phone face down with a laugh that rang false, and that was all the confirmation I needed. From that day forward, I carried silence like a weapon. I didn't accuse, I didn't question, I simply watched. Evan's phone never left his hand, his late nights piled higher, and Tasha's excuses matched his almost word for word. The lies overlapped like lines in a poorly rehearsed play. My chest hollowed out, but my face stayed calm. The proof I couldn't ignore arrived when I found a hotel receipt in the pocket of Evan's jacket, tucked away like a forgotten scrap. 2 names printed neatly, his and hers. My fingers went numb holding that thin slip of paper, as if it were a stone sinking me to the bottom of a cold river. I expected tears or screaming, but instead I laughed. It was a low, humorless sound that startled even me. In that moment, grief slid aside and something sharper settled in its place. 2 weeks later, I saw them together. I was stopped at an intersection when Evan's red sedan pulled into the back lot of a hotel I knew too well. Tasha stepped out beside him, her hand brushing his arm, her mouth lifting toward his like it belonged there. They slipped through the glass doors together, casual and practiced, as if they'd done it 100 times. Horns blared behind me, but I didn't move. My fingers locked around the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the place where they disappeared. That was the moment everything ended. Not in suspicion, not in whispers, but in truth I could no longer deny. When he came home that night, tie loosened shirt untucked, he kissed my forehead and said, "Sorry I'm late. Client dinner ran long." I reheated pasta, slid it onto a plate, and smiled as if nothing had shifted. But inside, something had. The woman who once chose patience had been replaced by someone colder, steadier. The silence I carried wasn't surrender anymore. It was calculation. The next morning, Tasha texted me with her usual invitation lunch, just the 2 of us. I typed back, "Can't wait." My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment before I pressed it. Betrayal doesn't end with discovery. It begins there. And I had finally stepped onto the path that would take me from grief to something far more powerful. From the outside, I carried myself the same. I still packed Evan's lunch in the mornings, folded laundry in quiet stacks, and showed up to school with a patient smile for the children who leaned on me. Inside, though, I was hollow. My heart beat, but it didn't move blood the way it used to. Nights became the hardest part. I would lie beside Evan, his arm draped across my waist, the steady rhythm of his breath sounding like a stranger's lullaby. I stared at the ceiling, wondering how many times that same arm had pulled Tasha close. I tried to match my breathing to his so he wouldn't sense the storm beneath my ribs. Every detail became sharper once I stopped denying what I already knew. When he came home late, his shirt rumpled, I no longer asked about clients or contracts. I listened instead, memorizing every excuse he crafted with practiced ease. Tasha's words began to sound like echoes of his, her canceled plans, her sudden errands, all fitting together too smoothly to be coincidence. They thought they were careful, but their lies overlapped like poorly cut wallpaper edges, showing where they didn't quite meet. One evening, she stopped by unannounced with a bouquet of yellow lilies, my favorite. She smiled so brightly it almost blinded me, wrapping me in a hug that lingered too long. I felt the rapid beat of her heart against mine, a rhythm that betrayed the calm mask she wore. "Rough week," she said, her voice light, though her eyes darted away. "Men are exhausting." I nearly laughed, not out of humor, but out of the bitter irony. She sat at my kitchen table sipping wine and pretending to be my confidant. I sat across from her, nodding at the right places, feeling the weight of a blade pressed between us, hidden by her charm. Even simple moments twisted under suspicion. I once found a single gold hairpin wedged in the seat of Evan's car. I don't wear pins, and he brushed it off with a careless shrug. Later that same week, I spotted the exact kind in Tasha's bathroom, lined neatly in a glass dish. That night, I lay awake with the image looping in my mind. The smallest things, a pin, a scent, a slip of the tongue, cut deeper than any confrontation could. They were proof enough to poison the air I breathed. I began to feel like a ghost in my own home. My hands went through the motions, cooking, cleaning, folding, but my thoughts circled the truth like vultures over something already dead. Grief settled heavy in me, but rage followed close behind. Sometimes I caught myself gripping the edge of the counter just to steady my body against the wave that threatened to pull me under. Still, I said nothing. I kept my silence sharp, letting it build inside me until it became a weapon all its own. There was a night when Evan came home later than usual. He dropped his keys into the bowl by the door, kissed my cheek, and thanked me for keeping dinner warm. As he sat at the table reheating pasta, I studied him the way you study a stranger you're trying to understand. His hands were steady, his voice even, and if I hadn't known better, I might have believed every word. That was the cruelty of it. He played his role so well that I almost convinced myself I was the one imagining things. But then his phone lit up just for a second, and I saw her name. He flipped it face down without missing a beat, and the knife twisted deeper. Tasha continued to show up as if nothing had shifted between us. She called with plans for lunch, suggested a movie night, even curled up on my couch with popcorn like we were teenagers again. Sometimes she fell asleep beside me during a film, her face slack, her breathing soft. I studied her, then wondering how someone who had once been my shadow could become my betrayer. I remembered the nights we shared secrets under blankets, the promises we made to never hurt each other. And yet here she was, carving out pieces of my life while still asking me to share my time. Watching her sleep, I realized love hadn't protected me. It had only made the betrayal sharper. My family didn't see the cracks spreading through me. My mother commented once that I seemed tired, and I smiled, saying work had been busy. Drew teased me for never taking enough breaks. I let them believe those easy lies because the truth would have broken their hearts before I was ready. Betrayal doesn't just slice the one who's directly wounded. It bleeds out into every connection, staining the people who never asked to be part of it. The silence I carried became unbearable some nights. I would step out onto the porch, wrap myself in a blanket, and stare at the magnolia tree in our yard. Its leaves caught the moonlight glossy, even in the dark, a reminder that beauty can hold steady through seasons. I tried to breathe with it slow and even, but my chest felt tight, my pulse ragged. It struck me that trust is like that tree. Once the roots are cut, it may still look alive, but inside, it's already dying. I still loved them both in some twisted way, and that was the cruelest part. Love doesn't vanish with a single betrayal. It lingers, pulling at you even as you know better. I would catch myself reaching for Evan's hand out of habit, or laughing at Tasha's jokes before remembering what they had done. Each time, guilt followed like a shadow whispering that I was complicit in my own pain by pretending normalcy. The nights grew longer, the silence heavier, and I felt myself standing at the edge of something I could no longer ignore. I knew confrontation would not be enough. It would only give them room to twist the story and paint me as unstable. If I was going to reclaim my life, I would need to find a way to turn their lies into their undoing. That realization came quietly, not in a burst of anger, but in the steady coldness that settled in my bones. I could not go on bleeding quietly while they lived freely. I needed to choose whether to collapse or to calculate, and collapsing had never suited me. The night I saw them disappear into that hotel, I drove home without the radio on, without tears, without a single sound except the hum of the engine. Something in me had broken wide open, but instead of crumbling, I felt myself harden. It was as if the grief that once drowned me had burned away, leaving only steel in its place. I sat at the kitchen table, still in my coat, staring at the clock on the wall as if waiting for it to reveal what came next. When Evan walked in hours later, his tie loosened and his shirt untucked. He kissed my forehead and apologized for being late. He said his client dinner had run long, then headed toward the shower. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the man I thought I knew move through our home like a stranger, smooth and practiced in every step. That was when I understood that asking for the truth would only earn me more lies. If I wanted to survive this, I needed something different, something sharper than confrontation. The decision crystallized during an ordinary dinner 2 nights later. He was cutting into his steak talking about a new property listing. When I glanced at the messages on my phone, one from him promising late nights, one from Tasha asking to meet for coffee. Their words looked the same, as if rehearsed by the same mouth. That was when the anger settled into clarity. They hadn't just betrayed me. They were laughing at me in the process, smiling across the table, while weaving their performance tighter around me. In that moment, I decided I would never again let them script my role. From that night forward, every move I made was deliberate. I smiled when expected asked questions that seemed innocent and tucked away every answer for later. I no longer lived as their audience. I had become the author of a different story, one that would end with their downfall. It wasn't rage that guided me, it was cold calculation, the kind that feels almost like peace because it's steady, unshakable. I waited until Evan was in the shower one evening before I picked up his phone. I had memorized the code years ago, never once needing it until then. My fingers didn't tremble as I opened the messages hidden under a false name. Every word was plain, practical, stripped of romance, but thick with intent. Same time tomorrow. Don't forget to delete this. Wish I could stay longer. I sent the screenshots to myself, then deleted the trail before slipping the phone back where it had been. I folded the proof into a folder I'd started in my desk drawer, a folder that would grow heavier with each passing week. I drove past the hotel they favored and asked at the front desk for a receipt under Evan's name. The clerk handed it over without a second glance. Another paper for the folder, another nail in the coffin of their secrecy. Each time I added to the pile texts, receipts, bank statements, my resolve deepened. I wasn't just gathering evidence, I was building a weapon that couldn't be denied. At home, I kept playing the loyal wife. I asked Evan about his so-called conferences, nodding along as he described networking dinners and strategy sessions. His voice was smooth, every word polished, but I no longer listened for truth. I listened for inconsistencies, small details that I could later expose. Tasha was easier to unravel. Over coffee, she sighed about how men never stayed, how she always ended up with disappointment. I stirred my cup slowly, memorizing her every complaint. The irony cut sharper than any confession could. Silence became my camouflage. I made sure my mother saw me more often running errands with her, sharing dinner without Evan or Tasha present. I called Drew just to check in, strengthening my place as the dependable sister. To them, I was steady, loving, unshaken. That was intentional. When the truth finally came to light, there would be no doubt where the blame belonged. Nights grew longer, and still I waited. I had no intention of screaming or breaking down in private where they could twist the story against me. My revenge had to be public, undeniable, a mirror they could not turn away from. I knew the perfect stage, my mother's Sunday dinner, where every seat at the long oak table would be filled and where both Evan and Tasha would believe themselves untouchable. I rehearsed the moment in my mind the way someone might rehearse lines for a play. The clink of glasses, the warmth of roasted chicken filling the air, my mother laughing at one end of the table. I pictured placing the folder down between the breadbasket and the butter dish, quiet but unmovable. I pictured their faces when the mask slipped and the truth spilled out in front of everyone. I would not need to raise my voice. The evidence would speak louder than I ever could. There were close calls while I waited. One evening, Evan finished his shower earlier than I expected, nearly catching me with his phone in hand. I tucked it under a pillow just in time, smiling up at him as if nothing were wrong while my pulse hammered against my ribs. Another day, Tasha dropped her phone at the farmer's market. I saw his name appear under a thin disguise, D. Miller, before she snatched it up, laughing too quickly. I pretended not to notice, letting her believe she was still safe. By the time the next Sunday dinner drew near, my folder was thick with proof, hotel bills, text transcripts, even photographs that left no room for denial. I spent the night before sitting at the dining table, every page spread before me like exhibits in a courtroom. My reflection stared back from the glossy paper, and I barely recognized myself. The woman who once forgave, who once trusted, no longer lived in that reflection. What I saw instead was someone colder, sharper, and entirely certain. I slid the papers back into the folder, placed it carefully into my bag, and whispered a single word to the empty house. Tomorrow. Sunday came like a stage being set. My mother's house smelled of roasted chicken and buttered rolls the same way it had since I was a girl. Glasses clinked as Drew poured tea and wine. My mother fussed over serving bowls, and the children darted down the hallway. To anyone else, it looked like nothing more than another family gathering. For me, it was the arena where everything I had carried in silence would finally breathe. Evan sat across from me, charming as ever, his laugh echoing around the table as he told a story about a buyer who nearly backed out at the last minute. Tasha sat 2 seats away, sliding in her little remarks, her smile just wide enough to seem effortless. I had trained myself not to flinch, not even when their hands brushed as she passed him the salt. That night, I wasn't the woman who swallowed suspicion. I was the woman holding the blade steady and sharp. I waited. Timing mattered more than anything. My family was at ease, bellies full, voices light. My mother's magnolia tree framed the window like a picture of peace, its branches swaying gently in the cool evening air. The ordinary wrapped around us, and that was the moment I had been waiting for. Quiet settled between conversations, the lull that comes just before dessert. My heart didn't race. I had trained it not to. I pushed back my chair, slow and deliberate. Every head turned toward me, forks hovering midair. Evan's smile faltered just slightly, his eyes narrowing in that subtle way he thought I couldn't see. Tasha's hand froze around her wine glass. My mother tilted her head, her lips parting to ask what I was doing, but I lifted a hand and she stopped. I reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table, its weight heavier than any dish my mother had served that night. No one spoke. I opened it carefully, laying the first page in front of me. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, my voice calm, but carrying. A hotel receipt with both their names printed neatly side by side stared back at us all. My brother leaned in, his brow furrowed, while my aunt's hand flew to her mouth. My mother whispered Tasha's name like a prayer she couldn't believe she was saying. Evan cleared his throat. "Marla, this is ridiculous. We can talk about this later." His tone was measured, but the edge beneath it betrayed him. I turned the page, sliding it toward the center. Text messages, his words written in ink that could not be erased. Same room. Don't forget to delete this. Gasps circled the table. Tasha's cheeks flushed crimson, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Marla, please, she began, her voice trembling. It's not. I cut her off with a glance. Not here. Not tonight. She fell silent, her hands shaking so badly that red wine sloshed over the rim of her glass, spreading across the white tablecloth like a wound. The room seemed to close in on them. Evan's jaw clenched, his hand sliding across the table as if to gather the papers, but I stopped him with a single word. Don't. His hand froze midair, the silence pressing against all of us like heavy air before a storm. I placed another photo on the table, one that left no room for denial. Tasha's reflection in a hotel mirror, Evan's blurred figure standing behind her. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could have said. My brother muttered a curse under his breath, pushing his chair back sharply. My aunt turned away, unable to look at either of them. My mother's hand trembled against her lips as tears welled in her eyes. Evan's voice cracked, then the mask slipping. You don't understand, he snapped, his calm shattering. This isn't what it looks like. I leaned back in my chair, meeting his eyes. It's exactly what it looks like, and now everyone sees it. Tasha broke first. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't mean... She choked on the words, but my mother's voice cut through the air sharper than I had ever heard it. Didn't mean you betrayed your own blood. You betrayed this family. Tasha collapsed inward, her sobs filling the silence Evan couldn't control. He tried once more, his voice low, desperate. Marla, we can fix this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you overreacted. His hand reached toward me, palm open, the gesture of a man who had always believed he could smooth over any storm. I gathered the papers neatly back into the folder, my movements calm and final. No, Evan. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is everything. The room erupted in voices, my brother demanding they leave my aunt, muttering she couldn't stand to look at them, my mother quietly weeping into her napkin. Through it all, I remained still steady, as if I had become part of the table itself. The noise washed over me, but I no longer felt the weight of it pressing me down. For the first time in months, I felt lighter. I stood, slipping the folder back into my bag. Evan's face burned red, his eyes wide with a rage he couldn't unleash without losing even more. Tasha sat crumpled in her chair, mascara streaked across her cheeks, shoulders trembling. I looked at them one last time. You wanted each other, I said quietly. Now you can live with the ruins. I left the table, then the cool night air wrapping around me like a balm as I stepped outside. Behind me, the voices of my family rose and broke a household cracking under the weight of betrayal. But I walked away, calm, steady, the folder pressed against my side like a completed task. The night air outside my mother's house was sharp, cool enough to clear the weight from my chest. I stood still for a moment, listening to the muffled chaos spilling out behind me. The raised voices, the scrape of chairs, the fracture of a family caught in the blast. For months, I had carried their betrayal in silence. Now it was no longer mine to carry. Evan and Tasha could try to stitch themselves together, but everyone had seen the truth with their own eyes. The damage was done, but I wasn't finished. That night at the table was never meant to be the end. Humiliation would strip them of their safety, but exposure alone would not break Evan completely. I had kept one last card tucked away, one piece of evidence heavier than all the hotel receipts and photographs combined. It sat waiting patient as I had been until I was ready to use it. For days after the dinner, my phone buzzed constantly with Evan's calls. His messages ranged from anger to pleading. One morning, he left me a voicemail that began with shouting, accusing me of cruelty, then ended with his voice cracking as he begged for another chance. I deleted them all. He was no longer the man I once chose. He was just a voice unraveling in the dark. Tasha stayed silent at first, but eventually the texts came, apologies typed in shaky words, promises that she hadn't meant to hurt me. She asked if we could talk, if we could somehow rebuild what was broken. I never answered. There are some wounds that close only when you stop touching them. The fallout spread quickly. Salt Lake may have its share of streets and suburbs, but word travels fast when a scandal bursts open at a family table. By the following week, people at Evan's office had heard whispers of an affair. Whispers that came with receipts and photographs too solid to ignore. Clients stopped returning his calls. Partners pulled away from deals he thought were secure. His reputation, the very thing he valued most, began collapsing piece by piece. Still, I knew humiliation and gossip were surface wounds. Evan had built more than just an image. He had built a career on polished confidence, and beneath that shine, I had found something rotten. Weeks earlier, when I was gathering proof of his affair, I stumbled across documents that had nothing to do with Tasha. Bank statements tucked inside property files revealed transfers that didn't belong, money siphoned into an account I had never known existed. At first, I almost overlooked it too, focused on the betrayal between the sheets. But the more I studied the numbers, the clearer it became. Evan wasn't just unfaithful. He was dishonest in business too. I gathered those papers with the same precision I had gathered everything else. Account numbers, wire transfers, contracts that didn't add up. Each page slid into its own sleeve inside the folder I kept hidden. The night after I left my mother's house, I opened it again. This time, I didn't feel grief pressing against me. I felt purpose. I spent the next week making quiet copies, arranging them in neat stacks that told a story anyone could follow. Then, on a Monday morning before heading to work, I forwarded the entire package to the senior partners at his firm. I added the documents to an anonymous envelope addressed to the IRS. When I dropped it into the mail slot, the sound was small, but to me it rang like a gavel striking wood. The first call came 2 weeks later. Evan's voice shook when he told me. There were questions from the firm, an internal review, an audit on his license. Investigators were combing through his files, and nothing could be explained away. His career, the empire he thought untouchable, was unraveling faster than he could patch it together. That night, as I sat on my porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, Drew called. He didn't ask for details. He only said, "You did what you had to do." His voice carried both sorrow and pride, a mixture that steadied me. My mother's silence had been heavy after the dinner, but when she finally came by with a basket of groceries, she took my hand in hers and said softly, "You don't deserve to carry their sins." That was enough. The weeks that followed painted a clear picture. Evan's accounts were frozen, his license suspended while the reviews stretched on. Tasha's presence at family gatherings vanished entirely. My mother couldn't look at her. My brother refused to say her name, and my aunt sat in stunned silence whenever the subject threatened to surface. Tasha had chosen her path, and now she walked it alone. For the first time in months, my nights grew quiet again. I lay in bed without the steady mask of Evan's breathing beside me, without the weight of suspicion pressing on my ribs. Instead, I heard only the hum of the house, the soft rustle of leaves outside my window, and the calm that comes when you no longer live in denial. I hadn't set out to destroy two people. All I had wanted was the truth laid bare. But betrayal demands consequence, and they had written their own punishment long before I placed that folder on the table. I had only turned the page for them. The weeks after the dinner carried a quiet I had never known before. Not the peaceful quiet of a steady home, but the silence left when something collapses and there's nothing left to say. Evan's calls slowed to a trickle. His voice on the messages grew hoarse, stretched thin by desperation. Tasha's number still lit up my phone every few days, but I never answered. What words could possibly mend the ruin they had created? By mid-month, word of the investigation had spread through Evan's office. The polished broker, who had once been the picture of reliability, was now a liability no one wanted to touch. His license was suspended while auditors combed through his accounts, and clients who once trusted him turned away in search of safer hands. The house that had once been his pride sat dim most nights, blinds drawn, his car parked in the driveway like a monument to stillness. My brother told me he had seen Evan at the grocery store one evening, standing in front of the clearance bin with a basket in his hand. "He didn't even look at me," Drew said quietly, shaking his head. "He just kept staring at the shelves like he didn't know where he was." Hearing that didn't make me smile. It made me realize how far he had fallen and how heavy his mask must have been all along. Tasha didn't fare any better. My mother refused to let her through the front door, and my aunt's shame kept her from defending her daughter. The cousin who once filled family gatherings with her laughter had become a ghost no one mentioned by name. When I passed her once at the gas station, she ducked her head, fumbling with her wallet as if the act of paying quickly could erase the past. I walked by without slowing, letting the distance speak louder than any words. At work, I carried myself with calm steadiness, the same way I had during the months of suspicion. My students didn't see the cracks that had run through my marriage. They only saw their counselor ready to listen, ready to guide. But inside, I felt something shifting. For the first time, I wasn't carrying their betrayal on my back. The weight had been placed where it belonged, squarely on theirs. Evan tried one final time to reach me in person. He showed up at my door one Saturday morning, unshaven. His shirt wrinkled, his eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. "Marla, please," he said, his voice trembling. "We can fix this. Tell me what you want me to do." I stood in the doorway, steady as stone. What I wanted, I told him, was honesty. "You chose everything but that." He started to argue, his voice cracking into anger. But when I closed the door, the sound of it ending echoed louder than any words. The truth about Evan and Tasha didn't stay locked in family whispers. It spread through our neighborhood, through church circles, through the quiet conversations people have when they think no one else is listening. His betrayal became a story retold in fragments, each retelling cutting deeper into the image he had once polished. What he had hidden so carefully was now public property, and there was no taking it back. In the stillness of my own home, I found myself breathing differently. The bed no longer felt like a battlefield where I lay awake, counting the seconds of his false sleep. The kitchen no longer smelled of perfume that wasn't mine. I reclaimed those spaces, not with loud declarations, but with quiet routines that belonged to me alone. It was strange how peace didn't rush in all at once. It arrived in pieces, a steady drip filling what betrayal had emptied. Yet justice is never neat. My family bore scars that would not fade quickly. My mother's laughter was softer now, as if every joy had to pass through the memory of her daughter's betrayal. Drew watched people with a sharper eye, no longer so quick to trust. Even at gatherings without Evan or Tasha, the empty chairs seemed to speak. Betrayal doesn't just take from one person. It ripples outward, cutting through everyone who thought they were safe. Still, I knew the balance had been restored. Evan had lost his career, the foundation of his pride. Tasha had lost the family she once leaned on. Together, they had destroyed their own illusion of being untouchable. And I had not lost myself. I had stepped through the fire and walked out carrying nothing that wasn't truly mine. The weeks stretched into months, and with every passing day, I felt the pieces of my life settling into their rightful places again. Evan's career never recovered. His license was suspended, his reputation beyond repair, and the calls and messages that once came daily slowed to nothing. The man who once walked into every room, convinced of his own power, now moved through life as a shadow of himself. Tasha remained on the outside, too cut off from the family she once used as her stage. My mother wouldn't answer her calls, and Drew couldn't speak her name without his jaw tightening. In the end, they had each other, but only in the ruins they had created. My own home grew different with time. The air no longer carried tension or suspicion. I moved through each room without wondering whose scent clung to his shirt or what lies hid behind his smile. Even small routines like making coffee in the morning or watering the magnolia outside felt like quiet victories. I realized that peace doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. It comes in steady breaths, in simple mornings, in knowing the ground beneath you is solid again. I spent more time with my mother, helping her with errands, sitting on her porch in the evenings. Drew came by often too, his laughter a reminder that family can still hold strong even after trust is broken. Together, we rebuilt something not untouched, not unscarred, but steadier for having been tested. The wounds left behind were real, but they no longer bled. Looking back, I know I didn't set out to destroy anyone. What I wanted was honesty. And when that was denied, what I chose instead was dignity. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply laid the truth where it belonged and let it speak for itself. And when I discovered just how deep Evan's deceit went, I handed it to the people who could hold him accountable. That was enough. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it's a quiet shift, the balance restored without a word raised. What I learned is this betrayal can cut deeply, but it doesn't define who we are unless we let it. I could have let their lies turn me bitter, but instead, I chose to walk away with my head high. They lost their illusions, and I reclaimed my peace. That was the difference. Even now, when I pass the magnolia tree outside my mother's window, I think about the night I first placed the folder on her table. The branches swayed then, as they do now, steady in the changing seasons. Life will always bring storms, but strength comes from deciding not to be uprooted. I share this not because the story itself brings me pride, but because the lesson it left is worth carrying. You cannot control the choices of others, but you can always choose how you rise from them. Betrayal will shake you, but dignity once reclaimed can steady you again. Before we close, I'd love to know, which part of this journey spoke most to you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if stories like this bring you comfort, stay close. There are more truths worth telling.